In the vast stretches of Iran's arid interior, where summer temperatures often crept past 40 degrees, 104 degrees, the ancient Persians crafted a technology so quietly effective, it still amazes architects today. It involved no electricity, no freon, and certainly no humming condenser units. Instead, they built badgirs, or wine towers, tall, slender structures that channeled and cooled desert air, and combined them with yakchals, domed ice houses used to store ice year-round. The result was a marvel of passive cooling that made life bearable in desert cities centuries before air conditioning. You can imagine yourself walking into a dusty Persian town in the 5th century BCE. The sand has settled for the day. The heat still radiates from the mud brick walls of homes and marketplaces. But rising above the horizon are odd-looking towers with slatted windows near their tops, swaying just slightly in the breeze. These were not merely decorative spires. They were carefully calibrated machines. Their mission? To catch the faintest hint of wind, channel it downward, pass it over a pool or series of moist surfaces, and push it into the rooms below. The mechanics of comfort. The wind tower's genius lay in its simplicity. Each tower was divided into vertical shafts, sometimes with as many as 4 openings facing different directions. Whichever side caught the wind would funnel the breeze downward into the building. On calm days, the tower could act in reverse, drawing warm air up and out of the house through the natural buoyancy of heated air. It was adaptable, responsive, and all accomplished without a single moving part. Now combine this with the yakchal, a dome rising gently out of the earth, with its base buried deep below ground level. These weren't mere root cellars. Their name literally means ice pit, and that's precisely what they stored. During cold desert nights in winter, shallow pools nearby would be left uncovered. The freezing night air would solidify the surface water. Workers then broke up the ice and transported it to the yakchal, where thick walls made of a special mortar, called saruj, a mix of sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, and ash, kept the inside cold and dry. A quiet industry of ice. What's especially soothing about this system is how it turns silence into productivity. No roaring furnaces, no complex logistics, just men with carts and baskets collecting ice under moonlight and delivering it to cool domes where it might be used for months to come. The wealthy used this ice to chill sherbets, fruit drinks popular long before modern refrigeration, while even the modest classes might enjoy a cooler home and fresh food for longer. But this wasn't a luxury for extravagance alone. Cooling, in the Persian context, was also preservation. In the sweltering summers, storing food, medicines, and even scrolls or textiles became a battle against heat and humidity. A yakchal wasn't just a comfort, it was infrastructure. The broader climate network, these towers and domes weren't standalone marvels. They were part of a broader urban system of qanats, underground aqueducts that channeled water from mountain springs into the city via gently sloped tunnels. These provided the essential moisture and coolness for wind towers to function. In many Persian cities, the entire landscape was engineered to manage water and temperature quietly, beautifully, and with an almost meditative efficiency. The slow trickle of water through underground qanats, the thick silence inside a yakchal, the dusty breeze redirected through a wind tower. Together, they created a passive but powerful climate system, one rooted in observation rather than domination of nature. A global influence, forgotten centuries later, variations of wind towers appeared in Egypt, across the Arabian Peninsula, and even in parts of Spain. Modern architects in Dubai, Arizona, and California have revived the concept under new names like passive ventilation towers or sustainable cooling systems. But the source, that lies in ancient Persia, quietly humming in the desert wind. So, much of our technological marvels today depend on rapid energy consumption, but here was a system that accomplished the same comfort, slowly and silently, in harmony with its environment. And yet, one can't help but wonder, who was the first Persian engineer to notice that wind, when funneled just right, became cooler. Was it an accidental discovery? Or was it a slow, methodical process of trial and error beneath a hot desert sun? As the sun set behind the ochre hills of Yazd, long shadows stretched across the rooftops, each one crowned with its own unique badge. To the untrained eye, these wind towers might seem like stylized minarets, but to the people of ancient Persia, they were signs of wealth, engineering savvy, and environmental wisdom. In this section, we turn from the concept to the craftsmen, the bricklayers, laborers, and hydrologists who built this quiet empire of air and ice. A brick at a time construction in ancient Persia was often a community affair. While we tend to focus on monarchs and engineers, the actual hands that laid the bricks were often those of skilled laborers trained over generations. Building a wind tower wasn't simply a matter of stacking mud brick in a vertical shaft. It required precise orientation. Each tower had to face prevailing winds, which meant careful geographic study long before GPS. Artisans used mud brick because it had both thermal mass and breathability. These bricks were sun-dried, not kiln-fired, which made them more sustainable and easier to work with in the blistering heat. As walls rose, internal air shafts were lined with polished surfaces to reduce friction, and compartments were adjusted to optimize airflow direction. The topmost openings were designed with careful geometry. Some were split into 4 sections, like a plus sign, with each arm facing a cardinal direction. Others were more minimalist, relying on a single opening and an internal turning vane to redirect air. It was an elegant blend of science and art. Design meets desert. Let's pause and picture it. You're standing in the courtyard of a merchant's home in 6th century CE Kerman. The courtyard is lined with fig trees and glazed tile benches. A narrow pool of water shimmers at its center. Above, a 4-sided baggier catches the wind and sends it down into the room below. As you descend a few steps into the Shabastan, a semi-underground room reserved for summer afternoons, you feel the air grow cooler, lighter. It's as if the walls themselves are breathing. Now consider that this experience wasn't confined to palaces. Public buildings, mosques, even communal storage spaces use similar systems. In some desert towns, these wind towers became something of a civic symbol. Taller, more ornate ones indicated the prosperity of a district, like a silent arms race in ventilation design. The Yakchal, as a monument to winter-while wind towers, made life bearable in summer. Yakchals made the impossible possible, year-round access to ice in a desert. Let's explore the full process. The Yakchal began as a circular trench, dug deep into the earth. The lower the base, the more stable the internal temperature. Walls were built upward from this base in a dome-like shape, thick at the bottom and tapering at the top. The key was insulation. Builders used saruj, the aforementioned mixture of natural materials, to create walls so resistant to heat and moisture that some yakchals have survived over 2,000 years. In winter, shallow pools, ice, basins were dug nearby. Workers filled these with water each night, letting the bitter desert cold do the rest. By morning, ice sheets would form. These were broken up and transferred to the storage dome. Layer by layer, the yakchal filled. Workers added straw between, layers to reduce melting and allow for easier separation later. It was backbreaking, repetitive work, carried out with quiet determination under moonlight. The same workers might later serve as distributors, carving out ice blocks for summer use, weighing them, wrapping them in cloth or straw, and delivering them across town. Who owned the cold? Ice wasn't necessarily a free good. Some ice houses were privately owned, typically by elite families or local governors. Others were communal, administered by city officials. In either case, ice was valuable. It was used for preserving food and medicine, for cooling drinks, and even for treating fever. In some regions, midwives applied ice to reduce swelling in new mothers. Apothecaries stored herbs and oils in its embrace. And yes, the wealthy added it to their sweetened pomegranate drinks or melon juices, served in copper goblets at late-night gatherings. But what's most striking is how these systems were managed communally. The Qanat water systems that fed them required upkeep and cooperation. Families shared responsibility for clearing silt, repairing tunnels, and monitoring flow. Cooling, in other words, was not just a private luxury, it was public infrastructure. The engineers behind the curtain historical records from the Achaemenid and Sasanian periods suggest that royal engineers, often known as mihandusts, kept scrolls filled with climate maps, wind patterns, and material recipes. But they weren't lone geniuses. They worked with surveyors, labour foremen, and master builders. The elegance of the system lies in its modularity. Wind towers could be added to homes as towns expanded, and yakshals could be scaled up to meet growing populations. At times, the systems failed. A badly placed tower could redirect hot air into homes. An improperly sealed yakchal could melt its stock within weeks. These were slow disasters, more annoying than deadly, but they underscore how delicate the balance was between desert heat and man-made cool. Why has it been forgotten? Modern buildings in the Middle East often favour air conditioning, cement construction, and closed window designs. Yet, some Iranian architects have revived badgirs and yakchals in eco-conscious schools, hospitals, and homes. They are experimenting with hybrid designs, where wind towers cool not just rooms, but solar-powered systems as well. The future, it seems, might still benefit from the past. Still, it's worth asking, what would it mean to live in sync with one's environment again? Not just enduring the seasons, but embracing their rhythms. By the time you reach this part of the story, perhaps you're feeling the gentle hum of the wind tower in your imagination. The cool air, the thick, shaded walls, the slow tilt shadow of late afternoon in a Persian courtyard. And you might wonder, what happened to all of this? The answer is both simple and quietly complex. The legacy endured, not always as a direct continuation, but as a set of forgotten blueprints, rediscovered when the modern world needed them most. The systems that whispered in cities like Yazd, where the old town has been largely preserved, badgirs still rise like sand-coloured periscopes above the rooftops. Here, tradition clings. Residents maintain their wind towers with quiet pride. Some even offer tours, not the glitzy kind with pamphlets and audio guides, but word-of-mouth invitations to step inside a home where the air flows naturally cooler. Yet, as time rolled forward, the advance of modern materials, electric fans, and eventually air conditioning led many to abandon the ancient cooling systems. In the 20th century, concrete replaced adobe, flat roofs replaced domes, glass windows replaced shaded courtyards. Ironically, these changes made homes hotter. It wasn't until the environmental crises of the late 20th and early 21st centuries that architects and engineers began to revisit passive cooling as more than a curiosity. In that rediscovery, Persia's wind towers and ice houses became case studies in resilience. From Yazd to Tucson, a global influence in places like Tucson, Arizona, another desert city with blistering summers, researchers and builders began modelling homes after the badger concept. One school there built a fully functional wind tower in the early 2000s, cutting its energy costs by nearly 40%. Dubai incorporated stylized wind towers into its Green Buildings initiative. In Oman, a hotel revived traditional mud brick and wind ventilation as part of its ecotourism appeal. Even in parts of Spain and North Africa, where Moorish architecture once borrowed heavily from Persian design, similar structures have quietly returned. These adaptations are more than architectural homages. They're practical, sustainable answers to a world needing to rethink how it stays cool. Lessons in slowness. What makes the Persian system so comforting is not just its cleverness, but its tempo. A yakchal doesn't rush. It stores winter's generosity to serve summer's needs. A wind tower doesn't roar to life with a switch. It waits for the breeze, listens for it, and quietly translates its message into comfort. This philosophy of building with time instead of against it is increasingly rare. But perhaps not lost. You, sitting here letting your mind drift through mud brick corridors and over qanat-fed courtyards, are already part of the revival. To remember is to reclaim, and in that there's something quietly radical, a cooling legacy beyond architecture. There's also a cultural element to all this. Cooling in ancient Persia was not only about comfort, it was about hospitality. A well-cooled shabistan was a place to serve sweet drinks to guests. A yakchal meant that even in July, a visitor might be offered a cool towel or preserved fruits. These weren't luxuries, they were expectations of civility. We often forget that infrastructure shapes relationships. A society that can cool itself gently may have more room for gentleness. In some ancient Persian texts, there are passages describing the air of dignity found in a home that could breathe. The phrase seems metaphorical until you remember that wind towers did, quite literally, allow buildings to exhale. Final reflections. Stillness as innovation. So what can we take away from all this? We've journeyed through the physics of passive, ventilation, the labor of midnight ice collectors, the patient geometry of dome building, and the civic pride of windcatcher cities, all of it built on the quiet conviction that slowness and harmony with nature weren't limitations. They were the ultimate tools. In a world constantly chasing speed and scale, the story of Persian cooling systems reminds us that sometimes the most elegant solution is the one that waits, that listens, that doesn't try to overpower nature, but works with it, rhythm for rhythm, breath for breath. So tonight, as the air cools and your eyes grow heavier, picture the slow turn of a wind through a mud brick tower. Hear the soft creak of a wooden grate opening to catch the evening breeze. Imagine, buried in the earth beneath your feet, an ancient vault of ice, still there, waiting for summer. Next story begins. Ashoka the Gardener. From bloodshed to Buddhism in Imperial India. Would you like to continue to section 1 of story 2? Before he became the serene symbol of Buddhist kingship, a monarch who renounced violence and planted banyan trees for weary travelers, Ashoka was a prince with something to prove, and in ancient India, proving oneself often meant conquering someone else. In this section, we explore the early life of Ashoka, from his uneasy youth within the Mauryan dynasty to his infamous campaign against Kalinga, one of the most devastating military episodes in early Indian history. But don't worry, we'll move slowly, with care. There are no loud battle horns here, just the quiet footsteps of a prince walking toward a transformation he couldn't yet imagine. The shadow of Chandragupta. To understand Ashoka, you must first understand who came before him. The Mauryan Empire was founded by Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka's grandfather, who rose from humble beginnings, some say as a low-caste youth trained by the political mastermind Chanakya, to become the first emperor to unify much of the Indian subcontinent under one rule. Chandragupta was clever and calculating, establishing a capital at Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, developing a sprawling bureaucracy and employing a network of spies and messengers to manage his realm. He eventually abdicated and became a Jain monk, dying peacefully in a cave. His son, Bindusara, inherited the throne. Ashoka was Bindusara's son, but not necessarily his favorite. Ashoka the unfavored. There are many legends surrounding Ashoka's youth, and historians still debate their accuracy. What is agreed upon is this: Ashoka was not originally destined to rule. He was born to one of Bindusara's lesser queens or concubines. His older half-brothers, particularly Susima, were more directly in line for the throne. This marginal status may have shaped Ashoka's early temperament. He was reportedly intelligent, brutally efficient, and ambitious. At one point, Bindusara sent him to quell an uprising in Takshashila, in modern-day Pakistan, where local officials had revolted, not against the Mauryan Empire, but against its corrupt administrators. Ashoka handled it with swift, if quiet, force. His success earned him respect among soldiers and governors, but further distanced him from his father, who feared Ashoka's growing popularity. For a while, Ashoka was exiled. Imagine that. A future emperor living in the shadows, nursing resentment, honing his strategy, and watching from afar as the world underestimated him. Seizing the throne. When Bindusara died around 273 BCE, a power struggle broke out. Ashoka, now recalled from exile, eliminated his rivals, possibly including Susima, in a civil war that was brief and brutal. The courtly records are, as you might expect, vague on the details. But one thing is clear. Ashoka did not inherit the throne. He took it. His coronation took place in Pataliputra, likely surrounded by elephants adorned in silk and sandalwood paste, Brahmins chanting Sanskrit verses, and officials whispering behind their fans. But even then, Ashoka was not the gentle king history would later remember. Early in his reign, he was known as Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. The Kalinga campaign Kalinga was a prosperous coastal state located in present-day Odisha. It had remained independent of Mauryan rule, and Ashoka, still consolidating power, wanted to bring it into the fold. Around 8 years into his reign, Ashoka launched a full-scale invasion. The campaign was likely swift, but devastating. Ancient sources claim over 100,000 people died, tens of thousands were deported, and many more suffered from famine, disease, and social collapse. Let's pause here, not to dwell on the violence, but to consider the silence that followed, because it wasn't in the conquest that Ashoka became extraordinary. It was in the quiet afterward. According to his own inscriptions, etched later into stone pillars and caves, Ashoka stood on the battlefield of Kalinga and was overwhelmed, not with victory, but with remorse. He saw the burning villages, the weeping widows, the empty stares of captured nobles. He listened to the wind blow over blood-soaked soil, and in that stillness, something shifted. He would later write, "The sound of the drum has become the sound of the Dharma." But in that moment, there was only silence, and an emperor standing alone in it. The turning point. What makes this moment unusual in history is not just that Ashoka changed, but that he made the change public. He didn't rewrite the past. He carved it in stone. In a time when rulers boasted only of victories, Ashoka issued edicts acknowledging his guilt. This was the beginning of his transformation, from conqueror to gardener, from sword-bearer to tree planter. But how do you govern an empire with compassion? How does a king who once brought famine now promise mercy? And more practically, what does Buddhist statecraft look like in a society still rooted in ritual, hierarchy, and expansion? These were the questions Ashoka would grapple with in the years to come. When we last left Ashoka, he stood on the scorched battlefield of Kalinga, surrounded by the ghosts of his own ambition. Unlike other conquerors who basked in triumph, Ashoka recoiled. What followed wasn't just a personal spiritual journey. It was one of the earliest recorded attempts to rebuild an empire around ethics instead of expansion. In this section, we explore how Ashoka translated his remorse into policy, how his embrace of Buddhism, still a relatively young and regional philosophy at the time, reshaped everything from criminal justice to animal rights, and how, curiously, he chose rocks and pillars as his medium for spreading compassion. Let's begin with the stone. Stone. That spoke, Ashoka's most enduring legacy is not found in palaces or monuments, but in more than 30 inscriptions scattered across modern-day India, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. These edicts, carved into cliffs and freestanding pillars, were written in local languages and dialects, from Prakrit to Greek and Aramaic, depending on the region. This alone is extraordinary. Most rulers of the time commissioned inscriptions to boast of victories or divine right. Ashoka instead issued proclamations like, "All men are my children, just as I desire for my own children that they should be provided with complete welfare and happiness in this world and the next. So, do I desire the same for all men." And perhaps most strikingly, the conquest by Dharma is preferable to the conquest by force. Ashoka wasn't interested in sending armies anymore. He wanted to send ideas. What was Dharma? Dharma, or Dharma in the Prakrit used by Ashoka, is notoriously difficult to translate. It can mean righteousness, duty, moral, law, or even simply the way things ought to be. For Ashoka, Dhamma became a code of conduct that guided both personal life and state policy. But this wasn't Buddhist theocracy. Ashoka didn't force conversion, and his edicts repeatedly called for religious tolerance. He urged Brahmins, Buddhists, Ajivikas and others to live together peacefully, warning against arrogance and slander. His Dhamma emphasized compassion to all living beings, humans and animals alike, filial piety, kindness to parents and elders, truthfulness, and moderation, respect for teachers and ascetics, fair treatment of prisoners and servants. It was, in essence, a social wellness campaign carved in stone. Justice and mercy. Ashoka's new moral framework had real, tangible effects on governance. He reformed the justice system, appointing special officers called Dhamma Mahamatas to look after public welfare, particularly for the poor, the elderly, and prisoners. He encouraged visits to prisons, reviews of cases, and even pardons for those facing execution. Capital punishment was not abolished, but Ashoka sought to reduce it. In one inscription, he instituted a 3-day waiting period for executions, during which family members could visit or appeal. Such reforms, by today's standards modest, were radical in their time. A king offering time for reflection before death. It was almost unheard of. He also banned animal sacrifices in the court. Slaughter for palace banquets was reduced from hundreds to just 2 animals a day. Eventually, he claimed, even those were spared. A public health project. Ashoka's edicts reveal a deep concern for public health and infrastructure, again, unusual for an ancient monarch. He ordered the planting of shade trees along trade routes, the building of rest houses and wells for travelers and animals, the construction of medical facilities for humans and animals alike, the import and cultivation of medicinal herbs. He also arranged for veterinary care, stating in one edict that medicinal plants suitable for man and beast have been imported and planted wherever they did not previously grow. It's not a stretch to say that Ashoka launched one of history's earliest government-sponsored wellness campaigns, long before the word public health existed. A Buddhist king. Ashoka's connection to Buddhism is famous but often misunderstood. He did not become a monk. He did not build a Buddhist empire. Instead, he patronized Buddhism, funding monasteries, commissioning stupas, and encouraging the spread of Buddhist teachings across Asia. His most famous gesture may have been sending his own children, Mahinda and Sanghamitta, to Sri Lanka to spread the Dharma. Ashoka saw in Buddhism a tool for moral governance, not just spiritual enlightenment. He admired the emphasis on non-violence, mindfulness, and compassion. But he also supported other religious communities. His Dhamma, though inspired by Buddhist values, remained broad and inclusive. Soft power and diplomacy. Ashoka's commitment to non-violence didn't stop at internal reform. He extended it to foreign policy. He maintained diplomatic relations with Hellenistic rulers such as Antiochus II of Syria and Ptolemy III of Egypt, even sending envoys and, according to some sources, Buddhist missionaries. Inscriptions suggest he saw diplomacy as another form of moral conquest. Instead of dispatching troops, Ashoka sent letters, gifts, and teachings. 1,000 years before modern diplomacy, he practiced a form of soft power rarely seen in antiquity. Dhamma by design, and yet, for all his reforms and policies, Ashoka's most enduring tool was symbolic: the Ashokan pillar. Tall, polished, often topped with lions or bulls, these pillars were planted across the empire like silent guardians of his vision. They weren't just signposts, they were moral monuments, designed to remind, not rule. You can imagine a traveler pausing beneath one, reading the inscriptions aloud, perhaps in the early morning or as twilight settled in, a reminder that once An emperor had tried to govern not just with laws, but with conscience. But how long can a moral empire last? What happens when the gardener is gone and the vines grow wild again? Ashoka's vision was grand, but was it sustainable? That's the question we'll explore in the final section. When Ashoka died, sometime around 232 BCE, he left behind one of the largest and most curious empires the world had seen, not only for its size, but for its ambitions. He had tried with sincerity and stone to run a kingdom on kindness. To many modern eyes, it feels like an experiment that could never last, and in some ways, it didn't. This section unpacks what happened after the gardener king passed away, how the Mauryan Empire unraveled, why Ashoka's legacy was nearly erased, and how it was eventually rediscovered, by accident and by archaeologists. It ends not with conquest or collapse, but with a reflection on why the soft voices of history, those carved into rocks, etched into forgotten scripts, may be the ones we need most today. Ashoka's descendants and the crumbling of a dream. Ashoka's successors were not like him. Within 50 years of his death, the Mauryan Empire had fractured, its territories splintering into smaller kingdoms. Why? For one, Dhamma was deeply personal. It had grown from Ashoka's conscience, not from administrative blueprints. His edicts were never codified into law. They were more like public memos pinned across the empire. Without Ashoka himself to embody and enforce them, many of these reforms simply faded. Additionally, the empire was vast and culturally diverse. It spanned from the Afghan plains to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to southern India, maintaining cohesion, especially under an ideology that eschewed force, was a tall order. Regional governors, once loyal, began asserting independence. Some historians believe that Ashoka's demilitarization weakened the empire, making it vulnerable to internal revolts and external incursions. Others argue the decline was inevitable in any overextended dynasty. Either way, the peaceful gardener could not keep the garden from growing wild once he was gone. A forgotten emperor. What's most fascinating is that Ashoka was almost completely forgotten by Indian history for more than 1,000 years. Though Buddhist texts preserved his name, he became more legend than leader, a shadowy figure referenced in stories but unmoored from real historical identity. His actual inscriptions, those carefully worded Dhamma messages carved into pillars and rocks, were unreadable. The Brahmi script he used had fallen out of use and been lost to time. His name didn't appear in Hindu genealogies or royal chronicles. There was no cult of Ashoka, no lineage of rulers who claimed descent from him. For all intents and purposes, his legacy vanished. This is perhaps the most boring twist of all. One of the most visionary rulers in ancient history was swallowed by silence, hidden in the underbrush of forgotten stone. The British rediscovery. It wasn't until the 19th century, during British colonial excavations, that Ashoka re-emerged into the historical record. British officials, intrigued by mysterious stone pillars scattered across the subcontinent, began to study them more seriously. In 1837, James Prinsep, a British scholar and numismatist, deciphered the Brahmi script. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Ashoka's edicts could be read aloud again. What they found shocked them. Here was a king speaking directly to his people, not about taxes or victories, but about morality, tolerance, and compassion. The fragments of a lost vision returned to light. Ashoka's lion and the Indian Republic. Perhaps the strangest twist of all is that modern India, reborn through its independence movement in the 20th century, reclaimed Ashoka. His lion capital, once perched atop a lonely pillar in Sarnath, was adopted as the national emblem of India in 1950. His Dharma chakra, the wheel of Dharma, was placed at the center of the Indian flag. For a man nearly erased by history, that's quite a resurrection. But there's something fitting in the idea that a post-colonial republic, searching for an identity rooted in non-violence and unity across faiths, would reach back to Ashoka, the king who tried to rule with empathy instead of fear. The stillness of stone. If you ever visit one of Ashoka's pillars today, say the one in Delhi's Feroz Shah Kotla or the beautifully preserved column in Luria Nandangarh, you might notice how quiet they are. Not many people gather around them. They don't buzz with tour guides or selfies. They simply stand, tall, smooth, etched with messages from a king who once tried something audaciously gentle. In an age when most rulers measured greatness by conquest, Ashoka measured it by how many lives he could make better, not worse. He didn't always succeed. His reforms didn't survive his reign. His name was forgotten. But perhaps that's the point. Like any good gardener, Ashoka knew he wouldn't live to see the full bloom. He planted anyway, and so the question remains, can ethical leadership outlast its author? Or is compassion always a personal act, doomed to fade when the hand that guides it is gone? Now, let's move on. If you were wandering the streets of Istanbul, then Constantinople, in the late 1500s, you might be struck by a curious smell wafting through the winding alleys. Not incense, not spice. It was something darker, smokier, and far more addictive. Coffee. Welcome to the Ottoman coffee house, arguably the most feared and beloved invention of the early modern Muslim world. In this section, we'll gently brew the origins of Ottoman coffee culture, how it tiptoed into the imperial city from Ethiopia and Yemen, and how it became both a social balm and political threat. It's the story of how a bitter drink nearly undid an empire's grip, and why sultans tried and failed to ban it with increasing exasperation. The origins of the bean coffee wasn't always an empire-shaking beverage. In fact, its earliest uses were far more monastic. The first known users of coffee were Sufi mystics in Yemen, who used the bitter brew to stay awake during their long night prayers. By the 15th century, the drink had spread from Yemen's mountain monasteries to the bustling port cities of the Red Sea. Merchants, scholars, and pilgrims carried it onward, northward through Egypt, then into the heart of the Ottoman world. The drink followed the trade winds, and by the early 1500s, coffee had arrived in Istanbul. At first, it was confined to elite circles, doctors, poets, philosophers. Coffee was expensive, exotic, and a bit mysterious. But it didn't take long before it escaped the confines of palace and study and flowed straight into the hands of ordinary people. And that's when the trouble began. The birth of the Ottoman. Coffeehouse. By the mid-16th century, coffeehouses called kahve-khane had sprouted throughout Istanbul. They weren't restaurants, they weren't taverns. They were something stranger and more revolutionary. Public forums for people to sit, sip, and talk. Men from all walks of life gathered here. Tailors, scholars, sailors, janissaries, poets, bureaucrats. They played chess and backgammon, read aloud from epics, debated politics, and sometimes plotted. In a society where much of life was tightly scripted by religion, status, and decorum, the coffeehouse was a pressure valve. It was a space of relative equality. You could sit beside a vizier or a barber and argue about Aristotle or tax policy, or whether the Sultan was losing his grip. The sultans did not appreciate this. Caffeine and conspiracy, the bans begin. It started small. In 1511, coffee was banned in Mecca by religious authorities who feared it made people too lively and more likely to stir rebellion. But the Ottoman Sultan quickly reversed the decision, unwilling to cede control to local scholars. Still, the ichi fear lingered. By the 1570s, Sultan Murad III had become deeply wary of coffeehouses. To him, these places were less about warm beverages and more about whispered dissent. His response was bold. He banned coffee entirely. But banning coffee was like banning laughter or gossip. It slipped through the cracks. Vendors moved underground. Patrons disguised their cafes. Some even installed false walls and secret compartments to hide their beans during raids. Murad's successor, Sultan Murad IV, took it further. A fierce disciplinarian known for his temper and oddly specific laws, Murad IV made the possession of coffee a capital offence. He would roam the streets, in disguise, dressed as a commoner, and behead offenders on the spot. And yet, the people still drank it. Because the truth was, by then, coffee had become woven into the daily rhythm of life. Coffee as daily ritual, an urban clock beyond politics. There was something deeply civilizational about coffee. It wasn't just a drink. It was a daily ritual, a conversation starter, a way to survive the tedium of the day. In homes, women drank it during social visits. In palaces, courtiers sipped it between meetings. It was so essential that young women were sometimes advised to refuse marriage proposals from men who wouldn't promise daily coffee. Yes, really. And in a curious twist, coffee even became embedded in imperial ceremony. The palace developed an official role called the chief coffee maker, kahvechibasha, a position of real influence within the harem and the court. Imagine the scene. A powerful sultan, surrounded by advisors, making state decisions while sipping a meticulously prepared cup of spiced Yemeni brew, the same drink that outside his palace walls, he was ordering men executed for selling. How did this contradiction hold? Perhaps because, like so many things in imperial history, the Ottomans tried to control the uncontrollable. As we close this section, picture the warm lamplight of a hidden 16th century Istanbul coffee house. You sit on a cushion. Around you, old men murmur about taxes. A young janissary plays chess. Someone quotes Rumi. And the coffee, thick, bitter, and fragrant, never stops flowing. But what happens when a sultan can no longer suppress the habits of his own people? In the last section, we watched as the humble coffee bean made its way from Sufi prayer circles in Yemen to the bustling alleyways of 16th century Istanbul, causing minor religious scandals, imperial paranoia, and no small number of coffee bans. Now, we'll go deeper into the why of all this commotion, because beneath the surface of these bitter brews lay something more potent, a new social order, bubbling in porcelain cups. In this section, we explore how coffee houses blurred class boundaries, bred satire and subversion, and quietly reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. It turns out, it wasn't just the caffeine that kept sultans awake. When a cup became a threat at first glance, the fear of coffee houses might seem comical. Could a beverage really threaten the stability of an empire that spanned 3 continents? The short answer, yes. Not because of the coffee, but because of the conversation. The Ottoman state, like many pre-modern empires, relied on hierarchy and silence. There were spaces for prayer, the mosque, commerce, the market, and judgment, the court. But few places existed where ordinary people could freely speak, argue, or jest. Coffee houses changed that. For the first time, Istanbul's labourers and merchants could gather in one place day after day to talk about everything from marriage customs to imperial taxes. Playwrights and poets tested new ideas aloud. Gossip passed like wildfire, and worse, so did satire, caricatures of corrupt officials, mock epics where janissaries defeated mythical bureaucrats, jokes about palace eunuchs. These weren't just stories. They were acts of resistance disguised as leisure. And while most sultans never set foot inside a coffee house, their spies certainly did. The janissaries, Java. The janissaries, the elite military corps originally formed from Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, were among the most devoted coffee drinkers in the empire. By the 17th century, the janissaries had become more than soldiers. They were a political force with their own interests, factions, and brewing traditions. Coffee houses became unofficial meeting rooms where they discussed pay, politics, and sometimes rebellion. This didn't escape the notice of palace informants. One Ottoman chronicler noted that men who drink coffee plot together more than they pray together. And indeed, coffee houses were connected to several Janissary revolts, including the dramatic deposing of Sultan Osman II in 1622. After Osman attempted to curb their power, the Janissaries staged a mutiny. Coffee houses buzzed with unrest. Within days, the Sultan was captured, imprisoned, and, against precedent, strangled by his own guards. A clear message had been sent. Don't mess with the men who pour the coffee. The theatre of the brew it wasn't. All rebellion and rumours, of course. Many coffee houses became known for their shadow puppet shows featuring comical characters like Karagöz, a boisterous labourer, and Hatzivat, his snooty companion. These characters lampooned everything from new tax policies to court scandals, often under the flimsy veil of fiction. Everyone understood the satire, even if it wasn't named aloud. It was performance as pressure release. The Ottoman elite tried to rein in these cultural expressions, sometimes banning performances, other times arresting puppeteers. But like the coffee itself, the jokes kept flowing. Because ultimately, banning a joke is like banning steam from a teapot. It finds a way out. Women, coffee, and the domestic sphere. While men ruled the coffee houses, women had their own intimate relationships with the brew, especially within the harem. Coffee was an expected part of aristocratic life, a key ritual during kına henna nights, and courtship visits. It also became a subtle form of feminine agency. A popular tradition held that if a woman prepared coffee poorly for a suitor, it signaled her rejection, a quiet no wrapped in a bitter aftertaste. Meanwhile, within the palace harem, senior women such as the Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, wielded enormous influence over appointments and decisions, often over coffee. The beverage became a backdrop for diplomacy, negotiation, and even soft power. So while sultans passed edicts, their mothers might sip and shape policy over steaming cups of cardamom-scented brew. When the bans became ritual, by the late 17th century, the coffee bans had become ritualistic. Sultan after sultan would attempt to close the coffee houses. There would be raids, decrees, warnings, and within weeks, sometimes days, they'd reopen. New cafes popped up under euphemisms: ink parlours, story rooms, gaming houses. Everyone knew what they really were. Enforcement became lax, almost symbolic. Some historians believe these bans were never meant to succeed. They were performances, imperial theatre meant to appease conservative clerics while avoiding a full confrontation with the populace. Others argue the bans were dead serious, but simply unenforceable. Either way, the result was the same. Coffee survived. Not just survived, it thrived. And in a gently ironic twist, the Ottomans would go on to introduce coffee to Europe, where it sparked a cafe revolution of its own, from Vienna to Paris to London. In the quiet of a 17th century Istanbul morning, as the call to prayer faded and the sun rose over the Bosphorus, the coffee houses opened once more. Men entered, greeted each other with slow nods, and the world resumed its murmur. But how did coffee, once forbidden and feared, become an institution, enshrined even in imperial tradition? When last we left off, the Ottomans were deep in a paradox. Sultans banned coffee, only to drink it themselves. Coffee houses were closed by edict, but never stayed shuttered. The people, it seemed, had made up their minds. In this final section, we explore how the drink once considered dangerous became part of the Ottoman Empire's social fabric. From the rise of ceremonial court coffee service to the professionalization of baristas centuries before the term existed, we'll follow coffee as it evolved from threat to tradition. And by the end, you might wonder, when does something stop being subversive and start being culture? Brewing respectability, the rise of the kahveçi. By the 18th century, Ottoman elites had stopped fighting coffee and started organizing it. Enter the kahveçi, or chief coffee maker, one of the most curious posts within the palace hierarchy. This wasn't a mere kitchen servant. It was a position of influence, filled by a trusted eunuch or page, who prepared and served coffee directly to the Sultan and other high-ranking officials. There was ceremony to the role. Serving coffee was a performance with carefully practiced bows, silver trays, and intricate cups. The preparation itself was governed by unwritten but exacting rules. The foam must be thick, the grounds undisturbed, the temperature precise. For many palace insiders, being served coffee by the kahveçi was not just refreshment, It was recognition. To be overlooked during coffee service could signal a fall from grace. In time, entire kitchens were devoted to the preparation of coffee alone. And from these kitchens came a cadre of skilled brewers who would later staff embassies, noble households, and even European courts. Yes, the Ottomans exported coffee and their baristas with surprising pride. From Istanbul to Vienna, a very Ottoman export. While coffee had reached Europe in small quantities by the early 1600s, it wasn't until the Siege of Vienna in 1683 that the drink began its true westward journey. As the story goes, when Ottoman forces were pushed back from the gates of Vienna, they left behind sacks of mysterious brown beans. The Viennese, uncertain what they'd discovered, were guided by a Polish Ottoman interpreter named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who recognized the beans, roasted them, and served them with milk and honey. It was a hit. Vienna's first cafe opened. Shortly after, styled with Ottoman cushions, arched doorways, and, of course, coffee brewed in the Turkish style. From there, the drink made its way to Paris, where Voltaire reportedly consumed up to 40 cups a day, then London, where coffeehouses became known as penny universities for the price of admission and the conversations they offered. Thus, the once subversive brew of Istanbul's alleyways helped inspire Europe's Enlightenment salons. Not bad for a drink that once got people beheaded. The cafe as cultural anchor back in the Ottoman world, the coffeehouse remained a centerpiece of daily life. It evolved, adapted. By the 1800s, coffeehouses were no longer dens of potential rebellion, at least not usually. They were spaces for reading newspapers, hosting traveling storytellers, or even, yes, watching early shadow puppet versions of theatre. Different neighborhoods developed reputations for their coffeehouses. Some were known for backgammon tournaments, others for poetry readings, still others for religious debate. In some provinces, local coffeehouses acted as informal courthouses, where disputes were settled with the aid of respected elders and a few steaming cups. And over time, women began to access this culture more freely as well. While not as public as the men's coffeehouses, women's coffee circles became popular within private homes, especially in cities like Izmir, Damascus, and Cairo. There, over tiny cups of cardamom-scented brew, women shared stories, arranged marriages, and kept up on the latest family news. A quiet legacy, in the end. Ottoman coffee did not cause a coup, at least not a successful one, but it did cause a transformation. From sultanic suspicion to ceremonial respect, from whispered revolts to family rituals, coffee reshaped the empire not with force, but with habit. Today, if you visit a Turkish home, you'll likely still be offered coffee before anything else. It will be served with a glass of water, sometimes with a sweet, always with a gesture of warmth. And somewhere deep in the culture's bones, there remains the memory of when this cup of dark liquid was new, dangerous, and deliciously rebellious. As you gently place your empty cup on its saucer, you might wonder, how many revolutions begin not with a sword, but with a spoon stirring grounds in silence? You are a man of letters, though your fingers are cracked from cold. The year is 1250, and you wake beneath a turf roof, in a long, low hall pressed into the earth like a seal upon parchment. The wind outside moans across the Icelandic plains. More, a language than a noise, though you've never found the right grammar for it. You are a scribe, one of the most literate men in the West Fjords, and one of the few whose livelihood depends not on sheep or fish, but on ink, patience, and memory. Your job is simple: to write what others remember. Your body is stiff, and the morning fire is still only embers. But you have a saga to copy today, and the chief's cousin is waiting. The Icelandic morning routine, not as quiet as you'd think. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Icelanders didn't live in constant darkness. Yes, the winters were long, and yes, You had to oil your boots to keep them from freezing to the floor. But by 1250, most households had adapted in routines both practical and precise. You wake when the smoke hole shows pale light around what you would now call 9 a.m., though no one in your world owns a clock. The women have stirred earlier, the fire's been rekindled, and the sour scent of skyer, curdled milk, sits on the edge of your nostrils. A pot of herring porridge simmers near the coals, and someone is grinding dried seaweed for broth. You eat, standing. It's rude to linger over food unless it's a feast. And this is not a feast day. Your writing tools are stored in a wooden chest, locked with a key the size of your palm. You wear it on a thong around your neck, because ink and vellum are more valuable than goats in these parts. The scribe's toolkit, goose quills, whale bones, and patience writing in Iceland, is not for the hurried. You use a goose feather as your quill, trimmed to a fine point with a small knife, your most prized possession. The ink is made from soot, wine dregs, and urine aged just long enough to offend. The parchment, calfskin mostly, though whale skin is occasionally used when the traders from Bergen arrive late and you must improvise. You heat the ink with your breath, scrape the parchment with a bone, and begin to write. Today's work is a copy of the Laxdæla saga, dictated by a local skald who insists on embellishing as he goes. He pauses often to reflect on whether a man's honour was better served by burning down a longhouse or by politely challenging its owner to single combat. You nod, adjust your quill, and pretend not to mind. Outside, the wind has begun its mid-morning tantrum, pulling snow in low spirals across the landscape. It seeps in through the stone walls, and your ink thickens. You warm it with your hands and continue. Interruptions, sheep, visitors, and political intrigue. Being a scribe means you are both respected and constantly interrupted. You are halfway through a sentence about Gudrun's tragic third marriage when a boy bursts in to report that a sheep has given birth near the stream. This would not normally concern you, except that the stream marks the border between two families who currently disagree on everything, including lambs. You sigh, stand, and go outside to bear witness. This is part of your job too. You can write contracts, mediate disputes, record dowries, and, because the Icelandic Commonwealth has no king, you are often asked to remember what was said, so that it might be repeated with precision later. Memory, you've come to realize, is a form of currency. The wind grabs at your cloak as you wade into the pasture. The lamb is indeed across the stream, though the ewe birthed her in the shallows. Both clans have sent representatives. You confirm what you saw and promise to write it down before nightfall. No, one argues with you. Your hands are stained with ink. That is power. The day wears on, and so does the quill by mid-afternoon. The light has shifted from pale yellow to dim steel. You've finished 3 folios, heard 1 impromptu poem about snow, lice, and declined 2 offers of ale. Your eyes sting. The goose quill is dull again. You sharpen it slowly, listening to the sharp scrape of iron on feather. In the quiet that follows, you think about the absurdity of your task. You are copying a story that may not be true, dictated by a man who forgets names halfway through his recitations, onto calfskin that took weeks to cure, using ink that smells faintly of rotted berries. And yet, somehow, this will become history. 1,000 years from now, someone might read it in a language neither of you can imagine. You smile faintly and dip your quill again. As night settles and the hearth crackles to life, the room fills with low voices and the scratch of bone dice. You pack away your tools. The saga remains unfinished, but tomorrow is another day. But how does one preserve memory in a land where ink freezes and stories shift with the wind? Morning is for writing. Afternoon is for resolving disputes. But evening, in your corner of Iceland, is for something else entirely, remembering. As night settles over the turf hall, the long benches are full again. Smoke clings to the beams, and the smell of lamb stew mingles with pine tar and unwashed wool. Children whisper, old women spin, and the men speak in slow, deliberate tones. And you listen. You are, after all, the man who remembers everything worth repeating. Law in the age. Before paperwork in 1250, Iceland does not have a king of its own. Technically, it belongs to the Icelandic Commonwealth, an unusual political system, with no central executive power. Instead, it is governed by a loose network of chieftains, godar, local assemblies, thing, and one large annual gathering known as the Althing, the oldest parliamentary body still in existence today. But what does this mean for your daily life? It means that laws are rarely written down. Most exist orally, remembered and recited by designated law speakers. You as a scribe work in parallel, not to legislate, but to record deals, claims, insults, genealogies, and obligations. Tonight, you're asked to copy a contract promising 2 goats, a silver brooch, and a half barrel of ale in exchange for a cousin's hand in marriage. You do so carefully, naming witnesses, dates, and parentage. If there is ever a dispute, this document will become the difference between peaceful agreement and a lawsuit, or worse, a blood feud. It's not uncommon for people to sleep with such parchments under their pillows. Words once written can carry a heavier weight than swords. The art of the saga circle, but not everything you write is legal. You are, above all, a recorder of sagas. Long tales of warriors, ghosts, family curses, shipwrecks, love triangles, and the occasionally misplaced dragon. These aren't merely stories. They're ancestral memory passed from tongue to ink across generations. Tonight, as the stew simmers and your hands warm by the fire, the household falls silent for the voice of Snorri Bjornsson, the village's best skald. He begins slowly. There was a man named Egil, son of Skallagrim, and his beard was black as ash. You listen and jot names, places, key phrases. You won't transcribe it all tonight. Your ink would freeze before you finished, but you'll capture enough to reconstruct the bones later. The Icelandic sagas don't just entertain, they anchor identity. They explain who feuded with whom and why, who settled where, and whose blood still holds a grudge beneath the snow. As the tale winds through duel, betrayal, and an improbable dream about a talking reindeer, you notice 2 men in the corner exchanging looks. One of them, you recall, shares a great-great-grandfather with the villain in the story. You may need to smooth this over tomorrow. Meals, meat, and the mystery of seabird eggs. The food in your world is functional, mostly. Tonight's stew is hearty. Mutton, barley, a few dried mushrooms, and whatever flavour is lent by the salty smoke. Bread is dense and sour, and eaten in wedges from a communal board. But sometimes there are surprises. A visiting merchant from the eastern fjords once brought a seabird, egg the size of your fist. It had to be cracked with a knife, and though it smelled like rotting fish and cloves, the yolk was bright and buttery. Feasts, when they happen, are performative affairs. Men compete in verse, women in riddles. Mead is poured with ceremony, and each guest is expected to contribute, not just food, but a story, preferably one that flatters the host or skewers an absent rival. It's your job to remember these as well, especially the verses. If they're good enough, you might one day commit them to vellum. History, after all, is just what people choose not to forget. When words freeze and ink fails, not all nights are so sociable. In the deep of winter, when snow stacks against the doors and wind cuts through the turf walls, writing becomes nearly impossible. Your ink freezes. Your fingers ache. The quill splits. Even the vellum curls at the edges from the cold. Sometimes you recite instead, holding the stories in your head, repeating them under your breath, like a rosary made of memory. This is when You feel most like a bridge between worlds, not a poet, not a priest, just a man who remembers the old words and shapes them carefully for the new ones. The saga you copied earlier today ends with a line you can't stop repeating. What is written endures, but what is spoken sings. You mouth the words again in the dark, wondering which of your own will last longest. As the fire dims and sleep pulls the hall into silence, you find yourself thinking about the many pages left to fill, the births yet to be recorded, the insults yet to be formalized, the verses not yet composed. In a land without kings, what stories get remembered and who decides? You wake with ink on your sleeve and the smell of soot in your nose. It's dawn, or close enough. The smoke hole above you lets in a slice of grey. The fire is dead. The air is dry and crackling with cold. You flex your fingers. They're stiff, slightly blue at the joints, but they still work, and you have writing to do. Today's task isn't a saga or a marriage contract. It's something far more delicate. The reconstruction of a lost story, dictated by a man too old to remember the details and too proud to admit he's forgotten them. This is not unusual. When the memory fades but the names remain. The man is called Kettle, and he claims his great-uncle once duelled a troll with nothing but a carving knife and a poor attitude. You are skeptical. But Kettle insists the tale was famous once, sung at the Althing, he says, and laughed over by kings, if anyone in Iceland could be called such a thing. The trouble is, he only remembers fragments. A farm near a fjord. A midnight snowstorm. A woman who wore iron shoes. A carved bowl that could trap breath. Bits and pieces. Hints. This is the hard part of being a scribe in 1250. Not copying, reconstructing. Taking the scattered driftwood of memory and arranging it into something that floats. So you listen, ask careful questions, and slowly, line by line, begin to write. Will it be true? Perhaps not in the sense of facts, but it will be true in the way that matters here, emotionally consistent, rooted in family names, and useful to the community. Even if it ends with a troll. The weight of a written word. By mid-morning, the saga is shaping into something readable. It's shorter than most, 4 folios and a closing verse, but Kettle beams with satisfaction. He offers you a dried cod fillet in gratitude. You accept, mostly out of politeness. You have over 50 of these texts now. Some are stored in a chest lined with lamb's wool, others traded to local Godar, and a few taken to the monastery at Vide, where monks record them in Latin for curious readers abroad. It's a strange thing, really. Stories born in firelit halls, filtered through beer and boasting, inked onto calfskin by frozen hands, now travelling by ship to cities you've never seen. Words endure, sometimes longer than the people who spoke them. An unexpected visit from abroad. In the afternoon, a ship arrives at the fjord. Small, battered, but not local. Its crew speaks Old Norse, but with odd turns of phrase. They are Icelanders, they say, returning after 5 winters in Bergen. They bring salted fish, woven cloth, and a new story. One about a girl in Greenland who sailed alone with her dead father's bones to win her family's honour. You offer them food and a place by the hearth. Later that evening, one of them recites the tale. It's long, rhythmic, and oddly gentle. You listen closely, jotting notes with your finger in a bowl of ash until you can reach your ink again. This, you realise, is how sagas migrate, not across borders, but between mouths. The bones of the story remain. The flesh changes with the telling. You ask if you may write it. They agree on one condition. Their names must be included. You nod. History is full of egos, and so is your ink, the quiet work of preserving culture. There's a strange tension to your work. You are preserving the voices of your time, yes, but also shaping them, choosing what to write, what to omit, what to emphasize. You've changed small things before, corrected grammar, trimmed embellishments, softened feuds that could rekindle bloodshed. Does this make you dishonest, or simply a responsible editor? In this land of fire and ice, where winter lasts half the year, and no two men agree on who started which feud, consistency is more valuable than objectivity. You try to write fairly, but you write for peace, not for truth. And peace, you've learned, lives in the margins. Closing the book that night, you read aloud from what you've written. Kettle's troll duel and The Girl from Greenland both. The household listens. Even the sheepdog seems interested. As the last line falls into silence, someone mutters, "I knew her cousin," though it's unclear whose cousin they mean. Outside, the wind pulls softly at the turf eaves. You stow your ink and quills. Stretch your hands. There is more to write tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. History here is not made by kings or wars. It's made by people like you, scribes, with cold fingers and warm memories, trying to remember long enough to be remembered. You are a servant of the Ottoman palace, not a janissary, not a vizier, something far more precise, and in many ways, far more dangerous. You are a kahveci basha, chief coffee maker to the Sultan. And in the 16th century corridors of Topkapi Palace, that means one thing above all. You hold a cup that can decide the fate of empires. The rise of coffee in an empire of ceremony, the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, is a world of elegance, espionage, and endless etiquette. Ceremonies are not optional. They are mechanisms of power. Even how a servant bows or pours water is loaded with implication. Coffee, a relatively new arrival from the Arabian Peninsula, is gaining popularity among the elite. It isn't just a drink. It's a ritual, a political gesture, a whisper of intellectual sophistication. And nowhere is it more refined than inside the walls of Topkapi, where the imperial harem houses hundreds of women, dozens of concubines, and an entire staff of eunuchs, scribes, musicians, poets, tailors, and you, the kahveci basha. Inside the palace kitchens, your day begins early. Before the muezzin's call has fully faded, you're in the coffee kitchens, a separate, carefully guarded wing just beyond the palace's fourth courtyard. The shelves here are lined with delicate porcelain finkans, brass sezves for brewing, and jars of rare Yemeni beans kept under lock and key. Not all coffee is created equal. The freshest, shipped from the port of Mocha, must be roasted slowly over a copper brazier, ground with a mortar, and brewed with water drawn from a specific well behind the palace walls. Why this well? No one knows. But the rules are the rules. You brew alone. No assistants are permitted, not because you are secretive, but because the risk of poisoning is real. You taste every batch yourself before presenting it, sometimes 3 times to be certain, and then you carry it. Balanced on an engraved silver tray, you walk through the tiled corridors with steady feet. The scent of the coffee precedes you, rich and earthy. Palace guards nod. Eunuchs step aside. The path to the Sultan's chambers is one of quiet reverence. Coffee as a tool of politics. What the untrained eye sees as hospitality is, in fact, strategy. Well-timed cup of coffee can soften the mood before a political negotiation. It can cool tempers after a heated debate in the divan. It can buy a moment of silence before an execution order, or forestall that order altogether. No one dares to rush the Sultan when he drinks. In this pause, small favors are asked, secrets are whispered, poems are recited. Coffee, in the Ottoman court, is less a drink than a tactical interlude. And you, the kahveci basha, become a kind of gatekeeper to that moment. You have heard more than your share of secrets. Coffee in the harem, you don't just serve the Sultan. Sometimes you are summoned to the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and often the most powerful woman in the empire. Her quarters are quieter, but no less influential. In the harem, coffee is its own language. One concubine might tilt her fincan slightly before drinking. Another might return it untouched, signalling offense. Among these women, Subtle gestures determine rank, favor, and future. You once saw a girl pour her coffee into a potted plant. The next day she was gone. No one said a word. The rituals of presentation. There are rules for how coffee is served, and you follow them with the devotion of a monk copying scripture. The handle of the cup must face right if served to the sultan. The saucer must be slightly warmed, but never hot. The aroma must reach the guest before the cup does. This is timed with your approach. If you speak, it must be only the phrase, "May it bring peace to your heart." There are no deviations. You once watched a new kitchen boy serve without bowing. The vizier's glare was colder than the Bosphorus in winter. That boy now cleans drains in the camel stables at Edirne. You reminded yourself that coffee in this world is not a beverage. It is a performance of stability. More than a brew in the evenings, you retire to your own modest quarters just beyond the kitchens. There, alone, you brew a cup for yourself. No ceremony, no golden tray. Just hot water, dark beans, and silence. You sip slowly, thinking of the day's movements, the cautious smiles, the unreadable silences, the silver tray that reflects so many eyes. How many people have lived or died, all beginning with this bitter, fragrant cup? And tomorrow, who will the first cup be for? Before it ever touches the Sultan's lips, a single coffee bean has already travelled more than many of his viziers. It begins in Yemen, on the slopes of mountains near the Red Sea, where the plant grows in quiet rows, nestled into terraces carved from sun-drenched hillsides. The farmers who tend these plants don't drink the brew themselves. They chew the leaves or sell the beans to merchants bound for mocha, a name that will one day become shorthand for chocolate, but for now is simply the port of coffee. From there, a long and cautious voyage begins. One shadowed by thieves, pirates, and rival empires, all eager to interrupt the Ottoman monopoly on this now lucrative bean. But it is not just profit that makes the Ottomans guard their coffee roots. It is influence. The Ottoman coffee monopoly, you, as Kahvecibaşı, know none of this firsthand, but you've heard it recited like scripture from the porters and pages who visit the palace kitchens with their news of the world. The Ottomans do not simply enjoy coffee, they control it. For much of the 16th and 17th centuries, only the Ottoman Empire has direct access to the Red Sea ports and inland routes that make coffee available to the Islamic world and, increasingly, to Europe. Merchants must register cargo at Alexandria, bribe officials at Cairo, and carry stamps of approval from palace agents to ensure they aren't smuggling beans to the Venetians, who are constantly scheming to get coffee without paying Ottoman taxes. Back in the capital, the bean becomes not just a drink, but a mark of imperial identity, a sign that one belongs to the center of the world. You've seen lower-ranking servants and scribes take their morning cup with reverence, their posture straightening as if the coffee itself lent them dignity. Coffee houses and control. Yet not all the empire's coffee finds its way into silver cups in the Topkapi Palace. By the mid-1500s, coffee houses begin to open across Istanbul, and this, perhaps more than the brew itself, changes Ottoman society. At first, they are modest, simple places with low wooden benches, lanterns hanging from beams, and the soft hiss of kesviz warming over charcoal. Men gather not for food, but for conversation. They recite poems, read news, tell jokes, plot schemes. It doesn't take long for the authorities to notice. You remember the first time the Kavahanis were denounced in court circles. They called them schools of scandal, said they were breeding grounds for gossip, sedition, even heresy. A rumor circulates. Some say that when the Sultan asked what threat coffee posed, an advisor replied, "Your Majesty, in a mosque, they recite God's words, but in a coffee house, they write their own." It was enough to order closures, but the closures never held. Ban, brew, repeat. Across the empire, edicts are issued. No more coffee houses. They are to be shuttered, their owners fined, their patrons watched, and yet months later they return. Sometimes renamed as bookshops, sometimes disguised as barber stalls. Always busy. Even in Istanbul, Within sight of the Hagia Sophia, you can find men sipping quietly in back alleys, carefully brewing rebellion with each cup. You've heard that in Cairo, enforcement officers would sneak into coffee houses posing as customers, only to drink a cup, smile, and never report a thing. It seems no one, not even bureaucrats, are willing to give up their morning cup. Even the Sultan's own janissaries are rumoured to be regulars at coffee stalls during off hours. In uniform or not, they blend into the smoky air, just one more pair of ears taking in the news. The role of women in Ottoman coffee culture inside the palace harem, the rules are different, but coffee is just as present. Though few women go to public coffee houses, they brew their own, perfecting recipes and rituals passed between mothers, daughters, and favourite concubines. One peculiar tradition holds that during marriage negotiations, a young woman would brew coffee for her would-be husband. If she liked him, she sweetened it. If not, she added salt. A clever, silent message. You've served many such couples during ceremonies hosted by the Sultan's court. Once, you saw a girl serve salted coffee with such sweetness of expression that the boy drank it all before realizing the insult. He left with his pride intact, but never returned. That, you thought at the time, was a masterclass in diplomacy. When Europe tastes the cup at some point, the Europeans get their hands on it. Venetian merchants return with sacks of the strange brown beans, which they call Arabian wine. Coffee spreads across Europe with astonishing speed, Vienna, Paris, London. But unlike in the Ottoman world, where coffee remains a community, ritual, in Europe, it becomes a commodity. Back in Istanbul, you hear whispers of Parisian cafes, where men debate philosophy and women write letters over cream-laced cups. It sounds strange, foreign, and a little barbaric. Who would ruin coffee? With milk? Still, the competition is rising. You've heard of attempts by Dutch traders to smuggle coffee seedlings to the East Indies, and of coffee houses in London boasting their beans are freer than Ottoman imports. They may have the beans now, but they do not have the ceremony. And in your little coffee kitchen, nestled behind Topkapi's gilded walls, you brew as if the empire itself depends on it. Still, you wonder, what happens to power when everyone can brew their own cup? The sun sets over Istanbul with a hush that even the call to prayer cannot fully disturb. From the rooftops of Topkapi Palace, the Bosphorus glitters like spilled ink, and you, the Kahvechi Basha, move quietly through corridors that feel older than memory. The kitchen is quieter now. You are no longer young. Your hands move slower, though they still remember the exact angle to tilt the sizvi. Your robes are a little finer, your responsibilities less rushed. Still, the same silver tray sits on your table, polished each morning. The same whisper of roasted beans lingers in your sleeves, and yet something is changing. Coffee protocol in decline. Where once your job demanded silence and precision, it now requires diplomacy and flexibility. New palace officials skip ceremonial greetings. Junior viziers ask for coffee without bowing. A foreign ambassador once asked for tea instead. Tea, you served it of course, but not without a quiet moment of mourning. Even the Sultan drinks less these days. His tastes lean towards sherbets and fruit syrups. You suspect that the ritual of coffee, so tightly bound to Ottoman ceremony, is slowly unravelling. There is no announcement, no proclamation, just a slow erosion. You overhear younger staff referring to the coffee tradition as charming. They mean it kindly, but it cuts deeper than they know. You are not charming. You are the last link in a chain of meaning. One bean, one pour, one perfectly placed saucer at a time. The fall of ritual, the rise of convenience beyond the palace. Istanbul's coffee houses now outnumber the mosques in some quarters. No longer shadowy dens of poetry or subversion. They are louder, simpler places. Patrons play backgammon, discuss weather, complain about taxes. Even the brewing has changed. Ground coffee now comes in small paper packets. Charcoal stoves are replaced with tin burners. Copper sezves are losing their shine. You pass a vendor on your walk home who pours coffee from a samovar. Like tea, he pours 4 cups a minute, barely glancing at the bubbling pot. No ceremony, no aroma wafting ahead of him. Like an ambassador, just speed, you understand it. People have less time, empires are modernizing, but still, part of you aches. The coffee. That traveled the world, you think often of where the bean has gone. You've heard reports of people in New Amsterdam, now called New York, who drink it with ice. In Vienna, they serve it with whipped cream, and tiny violins play in cafes named for cities they've never seen. In Ethiopia, a priest lights incense before pouring his brew. In Brazil, they harvest beans by the ton. Coffee, once the tightly held secret of the Arab world, has become a global citizen. It has outgrown you, and yet, in each cup, some trace of your ritual remains. Someone, somewhere, still stirs before sipping, still breathes in the steam, still waits for silence. In every quiet cafe, in every late-night kitchen, in every bleary-eyed sunrise commute, someone holds a cup and pauses, if only for a moment. They do not know your name, but they feel your work. Reflections from the final brew one evening. You receive word that a new Kavitibasha has been appointed. A younger man, tall, eager, unfamiliar with the proper grain size for a Topkapi brew, but willing to learn. You prepare your final cup. This time, you make it for yourself, not the Sultan, not the Valid, not a guest from Vienna or Baghdad, just you. You sit in the palace gardens, where jasmine laces the air and the call to prayer echoes off the marble. You sip. It is bitter, perfect. You think of the centuries the Ottomans held this drink like a flame cupped in both hands. You think of the harem, the secrets, the poems, the power. You think of what happens to tradition when no one remembers why it began. And still, you smile, because coffee endures, and somewhere, even now, someone is learning to pour it just the way you taught, slowly, with both hands, with respect. And so you wonder, not sadly but curiously, will anyone ever invent a ritual to slow down time again, 1 cup at a time? The wind outside sounds like a kettle boiling, only colder, deeper, and somehow more personal. You, a low-ranking scribe in a turf-roofed longhouse tucked into the snowy folds of 13th century Iceland, draw your wool cloak tighter. The fire is stubborn today. So is your ink. You rub your fingers, blow on them gently, and lean once more over the calfskin parchment. The rune you've just drawn looks vaguely like a goat. That is not what it's supposed to look like. Still, no one will see it until spring. Maybe not even then. The morning routine of a medieval Icelandic scribe. You wake to darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, literal, biting, unrelenting winter dark that lasts up to 20 hours a day. The walls of your longhouse creak with the frost, and a tiny skylight glows with the faintest blue when the sun finally rises at midday. Your first task is to check on the ink. It freezes, constantly. So you keep the pot nestled beside your bedding, tucked in like a sleeping kitten. Breakfast is skaya, a kind of sour yogurt if you're lucky, or just dried fish dipped in butter. You chew slowly, imagining a land where butter is not an occasional luxury, but a casual condiment. The script you're copying today is a legal saga, something about grazing rights and a dispute over fence stones. Riveting stuff. But your job is not to judge, it's to preserve. The scriptorium, sort of. Unlike the grand scriptoriums of France or Italy, your writing space is more of a corner than a chamber. No monks, no stained glass, no vaulted ceilings. Just you, a plank table, a stool, and a goat that occasionally wanders inside. Your quill is made from a raven feather. Raven, because geese are rare here, and nobody is fool enough to waste a perfectly good goose on pens. You whittled the tip, yourself using a knife so dull it might qualify as a spoon in other parts of Europe. The ink you use is brewed from soot, water, and fermented sheep's urine, lovingly aged to just the right acidity. You try not to think about that when you lick your finger to smudge a mistake. Mistakes, by the way, are corrected by scraping the calfskin with a dull blade and carefully rubbing it smooth with a stone. It's called a pumice. You call it the reason your thumb is permanently sore. A long tradition of short days writing in Iceland is a seasonal affair. During the long winters, everyone becomes a little more bookish. Oral tales are passed by the fire, but parchment is saved for the truly important stuff. Family genealogies, land laws, saints' lives, and the occasional poem about someone being betrayed in a fjord. You are proudest of your poems, though they're not considered especially useful. One begins, "Snow rests like a widow's sigh upon the thatch, and ink runs slower than melted fat." It's not bad. Your cousin calls it mopey, but what does he know? He herds sheep, visitors, gossip, and the scribe's social calendar. This week, there are rumours of a merchant ship docked in the south, bringing news of a new bishop. Some say he's from Norway, others claim he's English. Either way, you suspect he'll want copies of things. Parchments stamped and sealed, edicts translated, maybe even a fresh copy of the Book of Psalms. More work for you, but also more ink, more food, and possibly even a pair of proper boots if you flatter the right people. Your current boots are held together with twine and mild curses. As a scribe, you are both necessary and invisible. People respect the work. They just don't want to hear too much about it. Unless, of course, the copy you make leaves out a family, name or changes a boundary line, then suddenly you are very visible, usually in a barn court, arguing with someone who smells like moss. When the pen fails, the voice remains. On nights when the ink freezes or the goats chew your parchment, again, you retreat to oral tradition. You join your neighbours around the fire and recite stories from memory. Not grand epics, but sagas of everyday survival. The tale of the man who accidentally married 2 women because he fell asleep at the thing, or the widow who tricked her neighbour into giving up his best cow. These aren't just stories, they're legal precedents, cultural codes, and social glue, and you write them down when the weather allows, because parchment is precious and memory fades. And yet, why bother? Tonight, the wind howls like a poem you haven't written yet. You sit by the dying fire with your fingers stained black and your eyes tired from reading runes by candlelight. A passing thought, will anyone ever read this? This dry record of someone's sheep fence, this poem about wet boots, this psalm, rewritten for the 6th time because the bishop wanted it in around a hand. You wonder, when the snow melts, when the longhouse falls, when the sagas are forgotten, will your words still whisper through the parchment? You hope so, but you're not sure. Still, you dip your pen one more time. After all, what else is there to do in the dark? The wind has settled today, which is rare. A pale sun rolls along the sky like a coin tossed lazily across a table, never quite committing to shine. You've opened the small shutter near your workbench, partly for light, mostly for air. The ink smell is strong this morning, stronger than usual. You wonder if someone forgot to cork the sheep urine jar. Still, you work. There are legal disputes to copy, edicts to draft, and a family saga that's taken a dramatic turn involving a broken comb and a misplaced cheese wheel. You know better than to laugh. In Iceland, such things can end in blood feuds, and the parchment doesn't care whether you find it funny or not. A society of scribes and sheep life here runs on 2 engines, words and wool. Your longhouse, like all others, is warmed more by livestock than by fire. Sheep live below your floorboards, their heat rising through gaps in the planks. It's a symbiotic system. Your pen documents land rights, and their wool keeps your feet from falling off in winter. Most households own at least a few sagas copied out over decades and stored like heirlooms. But they're not just bedtime stories. They are maps of who betrayed whom, who settled where, and what debts still linger from generations past. As a scribe, You're trusted to keep these maps honest, but you're also aware that no one is truly impartial. When ink meets skin, you remember when you were asked to copy the saga of Thorkel Toothless. The family paid you in dried fish and asked, politely but firmly, that you emphasize Thorkel's heroic silence during battle, not the part where he allegedly tripped on a sheep. You complied, of course. You are, after all, a scribe, not a revolutionary. The Thing, where ink becomes argument. Once a year, scribes like you are summoned to the Althing, Iceland's open-air parliament. It's held on the plains of Thingvellir, where ancient lava fields stretch beneath glacial cliffs. There, laws are spoken aloud and disputes settled, ideally without swords. Your role is not to speak, but to provide the paper trail, or more accurately, the calfskin trail. It's a chaotic few days. Tents are pitched, lambs roasted, debts aired, poets duel with insults, merchants haggle over soapstone and walrus ivory. Somewhere, someone is always loudly misunderstanding a land boundary. You sit beneath a crude awning, scrolls spread before you, and answer questions like, is this the same Thorgeir who married Gudrun, or a different one? Did Snorri pay the sheep tax for 1246 or just claim he did? Do you have the document where Einar says the field in question is shaped like a boot? You usually do, and when you don't, you improvise carefully, because memory can be challenged, but a written word, bound and sealed, becomes law. When your writing changes lives and sheep ownership. Once many years ago, you miscopied a name in a land deed. Harold became Hrafen. A simple slip. It changed the legal owner of a narrow but lucrative grazing field. Two families argued for years. You apologized, of course, quietly, sincerely. But the ruling stood. Ink, unlike memory, doesn't fade so easily. Since then, you've triple-checked every name, even the ones with 6 consonants in a row. You've learned that being boring is a kind of power, because in a land ruled by stories and stones, the one who holds the ink can tip the balance, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but just enough to redirect a stream or settle a feud. Between sagas and psalms, your days drift between 2 realms. The holy world, where you copy Latin texts, mostly psalms, for the bishop and his monks. You do not read Latin, but you know the shapes of the letters. You trace them like a child tracing footsteps in snow, without always knowing where they lead. The secular world, where you write sagas, family trees, court cases, sheep tallies, weather records, and the occasional insult disguised as a poem. Both require precision. Both carry weight, but only one lets you smuggle in a little creativity. Sometimes, hidden in the margins of a long, dull land contract, you draw tiny ships, or foxes, or once, a man slipping on ice. The bishop never noticed, or if he did, he said nothing. The whisper of a larger world one night. You meet a traveller from Greenland who speaks of strange lands further west, a place where grapes grow wild and winters are soft. He says he sailed there once, though he was drunk when they landed. You've read the old tales of Vinland. You always thought they were fanciful. Now you wonder. Your fingers itch to write something more than a sheep ledger, to copy a map, to imagine new runes for new lands. But your next task is to record a legal dispute about a miscounted haystack. You sigh, dip your pen, and begin again. And so you wonder, are the stories we don't write down the ones we most forget, or the ones we most remember? The candle is down to a nub. It sputters gently as you press the quill into the inkwell again. Outside, frost feathers the wooden sill. The sheep have settled for the night beneath the floorboards, just a low shuffle here and there as they shift, in their straw beds. You're alone at your bench, still copying. There is no audience for your work, no fame, no compensation beyond a smoked lamb haunch now and then, or a knitted wool sleeve if you're lucky. And yet page after page, you keep going, because someone must. Because words, if recorded well, last longer than wind and weather. The quiet heroism of accuracy. It might be tempting, sometimes, to embellish, to make a farmer seem more noble, or a feud more poetic, or a family line more legitimate. The temptation is understandable. People bring you ale and flattery in equal measure when they make requests. But you've seen the danger of casual exaggeration, a single mistaken name, a minor flourish in an inheritance claim. These small errors have sparked arguments, duels, decades of silence between families. You learned early to let the ink be dull, precise, and unyielding. That's how scribes shape history, not by telling grand tales, but by getting the spelling right on the names of sheep. The scribe's tools: feather, skin, and salt. The tools of your trade are simple: a goose feather, trimmed carefully with a bone-handled knife; ink made from soot, iron gall, or crushed berries, depending on what supplies came in from abroad. Your pages are calfskin vellum, smoothed and stretched and seasoned in salt. Each piece of parchment is worth nearly as much as a goat. You waste nothing. Errors are scraped away gently with a knife, then dusted with pumice. You've become quite skilled at making corrections look invisible. In a good year, you can finish a complete family saga. In a bad year, maybe only a few pages, thanks to storms, floods, or feuding patrons who demand rewrites. But you persist, because a copied saga is like a second life for the people in it, and you suspect, deep down, that even the dullest life deserves a second telling. Letters as lifelines. Sometimes, in the long, quiet hours, you allow yourself to imagine, what will the world look like when this ink is old? Will anyone still care about the saga of Grettir the Strong? About whether a certain Thord paid his snow tax in 1247? You've heard rumours of new ships, larger than any Iceland has ever seen, sailing from kingdoms far away. Of scribes who know, longer write by hand but with presses made of metal. You doubt it. It sounds like the kind of story you'd find tucked into the back of a saga, just after the part where the troll is banished. But you still wonder, will someone, centuries from now, open a scroll you copied and run their fingers across the cramped black letters, wondering what kind of man you were? Will they notice the faint smudge where your sleeve once brushed the still damp ink? The thread that binds you've grown older. Your knuckles ache more in winter. The younger apprentices think you're too cautious. They want to write sagas with romance and swordplay, fewer goats and property lines. You don't correct them. You just remind them that sagas were not born exciting. They were made that way by repetition, not imagination. At night, you still dream of other lands. But when morning comes, you find comfort in the known. The scrolls, the seals, the steady rhythm of translation, the familiar creak of the writing bench, the whispered scratch of pen on skin. There is power in consistency. There is grace in patience. And in your own quiet way, with each precisely penned line, you are keeping Iceland whole, not with politics or plunder, but with punctuation. A legacy of stillness. One day, you'll die, likely in this same longhouse, perhaps with the last line of a half-finished saga drying quietly beside you. Someone will gather your scrolls, not knowing which ones were yours and which were copied by scribes. Before you, your name will fade, just as carefully as you once faded others into the footnotes of history. And yet, somewhere, a field boundary will hold firm because of your words. A family will trace their lineage with confidence. A stranger will read a saga, aloud in a language you never knew would exist, and the sheep will still bleat beneath the floor, warming the house where stories are born in silence. So you tell yourself, let the others crave saga-worthy fame. You are content to be the hand that quietly preserved it all. You are a coffee servant in the harem kitchens of Topkapi Palace, sometime around the year 1650. It is not yet dawn. The Bosphorus lies silent and silver outside the kitchen's narrow window slits, and within the tiled walls, all is shadow and steam. Here in the heart of the Ottoman court, your job isn't simply to brew coffee, it's to do so in accordance with rules so numerous and precise that the Sultan's coffee routine might rival the legal codes of a small country. When Europe tastes the cup, at some point the Europeans get their hands on it. There are over 100 of you, all dedicated exclusively to coffee service. You belong to a class of workers known as kahvecibaşı, and though your duties revolve around boiling water and beans, don't be fooled by the humble tools. Coffee is serious business in this empire, and so are you. The rise of the bean coffee, by now, is no longer new in the empire. It arrived from Yemen over a century ago, whispered into the court by merchants, mystics, and physicians. Its reputation, energizing, warming, intellectually stimulating, spread fast among scholars and officials. At first, it was controversial. Religious leaders debated whether it should be banned. Some called it intoxicating. Others praised its powers of focus during long nights of prayer. There were coffee riots in Mecca, coffeehouse closures in Cairo. But in Istanbul, the drink found a powerful ally, the Sultan. With his blessing, coffee became not only accepted, but codified. And when something becomes official in the Ottoman court, it also becomes ceremonial. Hence your job. The art of not just making coffee, but making it correctly. You don't just grind beans. You perfume the water with rose petals if needed. You check the flame height by eye, not tool. You know the exact copper pot to use based on the drinker's rank and digestion. You remember that the Grand Vizier prefers his coffee without sediment, but with a sliver of ginger floating on top. There is a separate set of instructions for brewing for the Sultan's mother, the valid Sultan, and still another for visiting ambassadors. For the Janissaries, only if invited. Every time you serve, you perform a miniature ballet. Approach from the correct side. Hold the fincan, small porcelain cup, with your thumb exactly halfway up. Present the saucer with 3 fingers, palm upward. Bow, slightly. Withdraw silently. No eye contact, no words, no visible steam on the pot. Your job is not just to serve the coffee. Your job is to make its presence feel like the world is operating as it should. A perfect, tiny planet orbiting in a delicate ritual of warmth and dignity. The hidden politics in a cup to you, coffee is more than caffeine. It's court choreography. 1. Misplaced saucer can imply insult. A sip delayed too long can be interpreted as mistrust. A missing clove might spark gossip. These tiny rituals help the palace function without friction, or at least conceal the friction under a soft froth. There are even rumors that coffee has been used to deliver poison, though you've never seen it yourself. You do, however, clean your pot obsessively, not for hygiene, but for reputation. If word spread that your sezvi, coffee pot, had scorched a brew, your name would drop like a stone in the social pond. You'd be lucky to end up preparing sweetmeats in the pantry instead. Lessons in patience from the coffee spoon. It takes time to brew coffee properly, especially the Ottoman way. You must let the foam rise, then settle, then rise again, then settle again. You are not to stir too early. You must remove it from heat at exactly the right instant, lest the oils burn or the surface bubble unevenly. And so, while you wait, you watch the light inch up the walls of the palace kitchens. You hear the scuffle of slippers in the corridor. One of the eunuchs carrying a tray to the harem. A muezzin's call begins to float in from across the water. The empire is stirring, and once again, coffee will accompany the day. From secret meetings to poetry readings to long diplomatic standoffs, you've brewed for them all. Judges, concubines, generals, scribes, even an astrologer who insisted his cup always be served just before the second rooster crowed. They trust you, and so the pressure mounts with each pot. What the beans know, you don't drink much coffee yourself, only on Fridays. But you know it intimately, the way it smells when ground from Ethiopian beans versus Yemeni. How some types bloom with a citrus finish while others anchor the tongue in a loamy depth. You can guess the merchant by the roast. You can guess the mood of the court by how fast the kahve flows. Today, things seem calm. The Valide Sultan has asked for cardamom in hers, a sign perhaps of nostalgia. The Grand Vizier's page returned the cup empty, which is good. He rarely drinks it all unless in favour. And as for the Sultan, his tray is still untouched, which could mean anything or nothing. You pour another pot, letting the steam spiral slowly upward. You think, as you always do in this moment, how did a plant once banned in mosques become the drink that fuels empires? You are in the inner court now. Well, not you exactly, but your tray is. A eunuch has taken the small brass platter from your gloved hands and is carrying it through the finely arched doors, down the corridors padded with rugs so thick that footsteps vanish. There, beyond the screen doors carved with mother of pearl, sit the empire's decision-makers, their robes rustling gently as they wait. They aren't waiting for coffee itself. They're waiting for what it represents. In this world, coffee is more than beverage. It's a signal of time, status, deference, patience and loyalty. The Sultan's acceptance of a cup can mean harmony. His rejection of it might send a message louder than any decree. You've seen alliances begin with a cup of thick, cardamom-laced cave, and you've seen a cup deliberately left cooling, untouched, as an entire delegation fidgeted in silence. Coffee houses and courtrooms out beyond the palace walls, coffee is also reshaping Istanbul. Coffee houses, once considered suspicious places where rebels and poets mingled too freely, are becoming impossible to suppress. There are hundreds now, each with its own customs. Some are quiet, hosting chess matches or storytellers. Others are smoky, raucous places where rumours swell like foam on the cup. Still others are refined social salons where scholars read aloud from Persian verse and sip slowly beneath hanging lanterns. You've heard that even judges and scholars sometimes disguise themselves and visit these coffee houses, more to hear the talk of the street than to taste the brew. The government tried, banning them once, twice, even built patrols to catch the coffee criminals. But every time they did, the streets fell quieter than they should have. The janissaries grew restless. The markets lost their rhythm, and so, like many things in the empire, coffee wasn't defeated. It was absorbed. It was brought into the palace, polished, made ceremonial. If you cannot stop a habit, you elevate it. The harem's hidden coffee world. The kitchens where you work lie on the edge of the women's quarters. You rarely see the residents of the harem, of course, but you hear them. Their slippers whisper along the tiled floors. Their laughter, soft or sharp, floats through the latticed windows as you prepare their trays. Each woman in the harem has her own coffee preference. Some want it as dark and bitter as the deepest Anatolian well. Others prefer it mixed with clove, cinnamon, or orange blossom water, brewed to perfume the air as much as please the tongue. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, is particularly exacting. Her coffee must be served just before noon, with a single pistachio beside the cup and a silver spoon laid across the saucer. The spoon is never used. It simply must be present. Rumour says she once delayed a political decision for an entire afternoon because her coffee arrived with a brass spoon instead of silver. Whether the story is true doesn't matter. It's told often and repeated with care. Servants, but not insignificant. There are over 100 kahvechibasher in the palace. You're not the most senior, you're not the most skilled, but you're trusted, which matters more. You've been allowed to prepare the trays for state occasions. You've poured coffee for foreign emissaries who marvelled at the unspoken meanings baked into every detail of your service. A tray placed quickly. The Sultan is eager. A tray delayed. He is contemplating. A cup untouched. He is displeased. Sometimes, you wonder if the coffee itself even matters anymore, or if the entire ceremony is just an elaborate form of coded language. But then again, when the Sultan takes that first sip and nods almost imperceptibly, just a twitch of the brow, you feel it, that warm glow of significance. You have helped maintain the palace's balance, if only for a few more moments. The protocol manual, you carry in your head. There is no single book of coffee etiquette in the Ottoman Empire, but you carry one in your mind, compiled over years of observation, correction, and wordless scoldings from older servants. You know, never let the grounds touch the rim of the cup. Always deliver coffee in odd numbers for the harem, even numbers for the court. When serving ambassadors, always match the strength of the brew to the rank of the guest. Never clink the saucer. Never speak during service unless directly spoken to. And even then, answer with "Efendim" and nothing more. You remember the one time a new servant did speak, nervously complimenting a guest's ring. He was reassigned to lamp cleaning the same day. Small hands. Lasting ripples. They call your profession boring. You don't mind. There's something soothing about predictability. The same motions, the same pots, the same careful pouring. And yet, each day is subtly different. New guests, changing moods, hidden meanings. You once spilled a single drop of coffee on a saucer during an imperial council session. The Sultan said nothing. But afterward, an older kahvechibasha placed a small charcoal sketch in your locker. It showed a coffee pot with a sword piercing through it. No words, just a warning. Since then, your hands have never trembled. An empire, in a demitasse. Sometimes, late at night, after the fires have died down and the other servants have gone to sleep, you sit on the back steps of the palace kitchens and pour yourself the dregs of a batch brewed earlier that day. It's lukewarm, slightly oversteeped. Still good. You look up at the stars and imagine how far the influence of this cup has travelled. Yemen, Egypt, Istanbul, and beyond. They say coffee is now being drunk in Venice, in Paris, even in Vienna, though the Austrians insist on mixing it with milk and calling it something else entirely. Still, you smile. Because you know, before it was refined, debated, banned, praised, and exported, it passed through your hands. And yet, as the influence of Ottoman coffee spreads across continents, you wonder quietly to yourself, what happens to a ritual when it becomes ordinary? When a symbol of ceremony becomes a casual habit? You wake before the sun again. The fire has gone cold in the coffee hearth, but your hands know the rhythm by now. With flint and patience, the coals breathe back to life. The copper pots are ready, lined like quiet sentries. The water has been drawn from the well. The beans have been crushed, not ground, just enough to release their oils, but not surrender their texture. This morning, the cup is not for the Sultan. It's for his cousin's second wife's uncle, a minor figure, a quiet diplomat from the provinces, visiting to finalize something small. You've already forgotten the details, but the protocol is the same. The difference between minor and major in your world is only measured in how slowly you walk with the tray. The long decline of ritual, the empire, they say, is shifting, not collapsing, not yet, but fraying. Trade routes bend toward new ports. French textiles are being worn under Ottoman kaftans. The court no longer debates Arabic poetry with quite the same fire. And more, foreign guests arrive asking for coffee with milk. Milk. You pause at that, not with anger, just mild disbelief. Not because it tastes bad, you've tried it in secret, but because it ruins the ceremony. The symbolic blackness, the bitter strength, the clear gesture of offering something unadorned. It all disappears when softened into cream. You've seen European diplomats bring their own porcelain cups with handles even, and you've watched your fellow kahvechibasha sigh quietly behind the tiled columns, polishing the traditional handleless finkans with a care that now feels nostalgic rather than expected. Whispers from the kitchen walls. You still keep the old customs alive in your corner of the kitchens. You still polish the copper to a mirror shine. Still arrange the sezves by region, Yemeni brass, Syrian silver, Anatolian tin-lined, each one seasoned with years of quiet service. But you've noticed the whispers. New staff grumble about how long the coffee protocol takes. They question why the spoons must match the saucers, why the rosewater cloths must be chilled, then warmed by hand before serving. You try to teach them, not by scolding, just by doing, by letting them watch. You tell them, this is not about coffee, it's about presence. They nod. Some listen, some don't. You once watched a young attendant deliver coffee while chewing a date. He meant no harm, just hunger. But the breach was clear, and the moment lost. The Sultan did not sip that cup. A cup across generations. Your son, well, not your son exactly, but your cousin's boy whom you've raised like one, has started learning the protocols too. He's quick, but his hands are too fast. He pours before the froth has settled. He rushes the final stir, but he watches you carefully. He asks about the cup with the small emerald on the rim, about the meaning of the rosewater towels, about the gesture of pausing just before serving, the half bow that says, "This is for you, but you are still above me." You see a kind of reverence in his eyes, one that gives you hope. He may live to see a different world, but you hope he still remembers the world you showed him, one measured by cups and silences and unseen grace. Falling leaves and fading fires. As autumn deepens, the palace grows quieter. Some ministers are absent more often now, preferring their estates on the Bosphorus. The younger princes entertain foreign visitors in new salons, where tea and sherbet are offered instead of the traditional brew. The hearth where you learn to cook the perfect Turkish kahve now sputters only occasionally. The bricks are cracked, the smoke holes no longer draw cleanly. One night, after the fires have dimmed, you sit alone and pour yourself one final cup. You don't brew it perfectly. You let it boil just a little too long. You let the grounds rise. You drink it from a mismatched cup just to feel what it's like. It's still warm, still bitter, still true, but you can feel it slipping, not the coffee, the meaning. Legacy in the leftovers weeks. Later, your cousin's boy brings you a small gift, a leather-bound book. It's blank except for the first page. On it, in careful script, is the heading, Protocol of the Coffee Tray. You smile, you touch the page, and you begin to write. Always heat the cup before pouring. Always walk with the tray at shoulder height. Never speak when serving, except with your eyes. Always watch the sip. That's where the message lies. The book won't change the empire, won't bring back the height of ceremony. But perhaps it will preserve something of what mattered, a hint of dignity in gesture, of history in habit, bitterness, sweetness, and the sip of memory. Long after you are gone, the palace kitchen will be remodeled. The copper trays will be packed away. The embers of your hearth will be replaced by modern stoves. But somewhere, perhaps in a quiet kitchen in Damascus or a family home in Bursa, a child will watch an elder prepare coffee the old way. They'll see the slow pour, smell the cardamom, taste the quiet, and ask, "Why do we do it like this?" And someone, somewhere, will answer, "Because once it mattered." And the ritual, stripped of empire, detached from politics, will live on. Just a cup, but brewed with reverence and served with silence. End of story 7. The Ottoman Empire's surprisingly elaborate coffee protocol. The sun is barely a suggestion, on the rim of the sky when you wake. In this part of Iceland, in the year 1250, the darkness lingers well into what others might call morning. But you are used to it. You are John, a scribe for a minor chieftain in the Westfjords. Not a nobleman, not a warrior, but someone who bends time into words. You copy laws, you preserve sagas, you ink the lives of men whose names will last longer on calfskin than in memory. Your home is a turf-roofed longhouse tucked into a rocky hill. It's warm only in the sense that it's not cold. The smell of dried fish, damp wool, and old ink fills the air. Outside, snow drifts lazily against the doorframe, and a thin wisp of smoke trails from the chimney. Inside, a single oil lamp casts a wobbly yellow light over the oiled parchment stretched tight on your slanted desk. You are ready to begin your day. A scribe's tools. Your writing tools are simple, but demanding. First, the quill. It's cut from a raven's feather, stiffened by age and habit. You sharpen it with a small iron knife, always with care. Too shallow a cut and it will scratch, too deep and it splays. Then, the ink. You make your own. Oak galls, iron salts, a hint of honey. It's black at first, but it turns a mellow brown as it ages, just as you prefer. Your parchment comes from calfskin. Each sheet has been scraped until nearly translucent. It smells faintly of tallow. You press it under a weight overnight so it doesn't curl from the cold. A scribe does not waste parchment. You measure twice, rule once, and copy only what must be copied. There is no room for flourish. Only clarity, precision, and an invisible kind of beauty. The morning texts today, you're tasked with transcribing an old law from the Gragas, the ancient law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth. You mutter as you write, slowly, rhythmically. The words roll off your tongue like a chant. If a man calls another a thief and the charge proves false, he must pay 3 ounces of silver. Your hand aches. You stop only to warm your fingers over a small clay dish filled with glowing coals. There is no real fireplace in your corner of the longhouse, only this dish, and a woolen sleeve tied tight around your wrist to trap some heat. Across from you, another scribe, older, slower, snores faintly as he leans into his own work. His beard dips into his ink pot now and then. You don't wake him. He'll regret it enough later when he has to blot the stains. Outside, someone is chopping ice. The rhythm of the axe feels like punctuation. Food, brief and boiled. Around midday, you break to eat. The cook, your cousin's widow technically, brings you a wooden bowl of lamb broth. Thin, hot, salty. Bits of barley float on the surface. There is a slab of rye bread, thick and sour, which you dip directly into the broth until it softens. You eat quietly. Conversation at meals is limited here. Not out of rudeness, but because words are precious. When you spend your days copying the thoughts of men long dead, you begin to ration your own. You offer thanks with a nod. She grunts back, which in Icelandic winter terms might as well be a sonnet. You return to your desk with numb feet and a warm belly. Visitors and recitations. In the afternoon, a guest arrives, a farmhand from 2 valleys over, bearing a letter, dictated of course, since he cannot write. He unwraps it from oily cloth, careful not to bend the wax seal. You do not open it. That's for the chieftain, but you offer him a seat near the coals and pour him a horn of sour milk. He's wet, frozen, red-faced, but grateful. He thanks you with too many words, the way country people do when they're nervous around ink and robes. You nod, then hand him a copy of an old saga to pass the time while he waits. It's Greta's saga, a tale of exile, trolls, and cold. He doesn't read, but he listens as you recite a few lines. You do this not out of obligation, but because these sagas are made to be heard. They curl through the air like smoke, winding between rafters and stone walls. They're stories that shape the way people think, and often, the way they act. He leaves after a time, smiling. You return to your transcription, a clause about sheep ownership, ink and introspection as night descends again. It never fully lifted. You look over the day's work. You've written nearly a full page, only a few smudges. One misspelling corrected discreetly. A minor achievement, but a satisfying one. Your hand hurts. Your eyes sting. But there is something sacred about it. Each word is a thread, connecting you to the laws, beliefs, and misfortunes of men who will never know your name, but whose names you preserve. You wonder if any future scribe will copy your work long after you are bones in the frost. Or if, in some warm library far from here, a scholar might one day study your cramped script by candlelight, wondering who you were. You smile faintly, and just before sleep claims you, you jot a small note in the margin, for no one in particular. Storm coming. Ink froze this morning, hands still stiff, but the law waits. The next morning begins as the last one ended, dim and silent. The lamp burns low, and the coals have cooled to ash. You wake beneath heavy woolen blankets, listening for the distant cracking of the ice. That sound, more than any sun, tells you the day has begun. You slip from your cot and pull on your tunic, undyed wool with elbow patches worn thin from years at the desk. You tie a simple belt, gather your ink kit, and walk into the scriptorium. It's no grand cathedral chamber, just a corner of the longhouse partitioned with planks and sheep pelts to trap a bit of heat. Today, your task changes. The chieftain has sent word. You are to prepare several copies of a legal agreement to be read at the coming thing, or winter moot. The word makes your back stiffen. Thing, the old assembly, equal parts law court, gossip session, and snowbound theatre. Your job, to ensure that when the time comes, everyone can read what they're arguing about. You have 2 days to prepare 3 copies of the chieftain's revised land claim. You sigh and fetch a new sheet of calfskin. Negotiating in ink this particular dispute between your chieftain and a rival landholder across the river has brewed for years. The boundary between their lands shifts every spring when the meltwater rushes down from the hills. One year, a grazing path is exposed. The next, it's swallowed by mud. The problem is both men claim rights to a marsh, not because it's especially valuable, but because neither wants to be seen as the one to give it up. And so you begin drafting a precise, painfully neutral paragraph. Henceforth, the marshland known as Elderholt shall remain in mutual oversight, with grazing rights shared according to seasonal need, excepting in seasons of blight or flood, whereupon you stop and scratch your head. Do flood seasons count if the cows are already moved? What if the cows die during a flood? You dip your quill again and continue. Small interruptions, big decisions. Halfway through the second copy, a boy bursts in, from the cold. Hrafen, the chieftain's youngest messenger. He wears no gloves and has a runny nose. You frown, not out of annoyance, but from the sheer lack of insulation. He hands you a wooden token stamped with the chieftain's seal. Your signal to attend him after supper. You nod and wave the boy off with a chunk of barley bread, which he accepts like gold. You return to your work. Copying is not difficult in the sense of challenge, but in its utter dependence on concentration. One error, and your whole scroll could be invalid at the thing. At the bottom of the page, you draw a small hand symbol, a manicula as some monks call it. You add it wherever a speaker must pause and emphasize a clause. It's these invisible cues that make law memorable, especially when read aloud in wind and snow. You wonder how many listeners will actually hear the difference. Evening with the chieftain that night, the hall fills with smoke and the smell of dried lamb fat. You sit to one side, warming your fingers, when the chieftain waves you over. He is not a grand man. Thick hands, a crooked nose, and a voice that turns soft when he's being dangerous. He gestures to the copy you've brought and squints at it. He can't read all of it, but he's memorized enough law to know what to ask. Have you softened the part about the east border? He says. You nod. I used mutual oversight. Ambiguous enough to argue over, but not to offend. He grunts in approval. Then he surprises you by asking about the margins. Can we leave space there? In case I need to add something the night before. You resist the urge to frown. Margins cost space. Space costs parchment. But you nod and make a note. He clasps your shoulder, your reward, and sends you off with a bone cup of hot mead. You drink it slowly, watching the fire crackle, and think how strange it is that one badly formed sentence could change the shape of 3 farms. The quiet. Before the moot on. The morning of departure, you wrap the scrolls in waxed cloth and tuck them into a goatskin bag. You walk alongside the chieftain's small party, mostly his brothers, a few farmhands, and the one-eyed cattleman who always insists he remembers the law better than the scribes. The moot is held 3 valleys over, beside a river that never quite freezes. You arrive by midday, greeted by the sound of arguing voices and dogs barking at each other. The thing is not one structure, but a field dotted with tents, benches, and snow-dusted boulders. At its center, a low platform of stones serves as the speaking place. You take a seat on the outer edge, your scrolls tight against your chest. The wind whistles. A man nearby is selling boiled moss pudding, and as the first speaker steps up to read a case involving fence stones and a disputed goose, you realize just how much of this country's law is anchored not in justice, but in remembering who said what, when, and how loudly. The first full day of the thing dawns with sleet and slow tempers. You wake to the clatter of hooves on frozen ground and the distant sound of someone hammering a tent post into the frost. Wrapped in a borrowed fur, you sip cold water and tuck the goatskin scrolls tighter into your coat. Today, your work becomes public. Not dramatic, not thrilling, just quietly important. Your words, transcribed days ago by lamplight and corrected, in silence, will be read aloud before 24 men who mostly want to go back to their fires and salted cod. Yet, what you've written could shift a boundary stone, or cause one family to owe another a summer's worth of cheese. At the center of the moot, a speaker begins to read an unrelated case, something to do with a missing sheep, or perhaps a cursed comb. You tune it out. Your chieftain's case is set for mid-morning. You unroll the lead scroll and glance once more at the phrasing, mutual oversight in all seasons but those of blight or flood. You nod. It still works. You hold the second copy for reference. The third stays hidden. Insurance, in case. One of the first 2 ends up in the fire, as has happened before. Speaking stones and frozen feet, the thing is organized by tradition, not design. There's no judge, only a law speaker. A man whose job is to remember the law, recite it precisely, and interrupt if anyone claims a right they don't have. You don't envy him. He has to stand on a flat rock, boots soaked through, repeating phrases like, "It is known by the fathers," until everyone nods and no one's sure why. Your chieftain stands beside the speaker's stone and nods for you to approach. You open the scroll with a small weight, smoothing it against the wind. The other party, a red-bearded man with 3 sons behind him, stares as you begin to read. Slowly, clearly, you speak the preamble. By agreement between the households of Elderholt and Ulfsvaten, under the 3rd moon of winter, you glance up. Everyone's listening now, not because they love law, but because they know a poorly read scroll can lose a